Hi everybody. So continuing our Old Testament journey, now we are going to talk about Moses. So we talked about Abraham in the last video, and the things that I want you to really make sure in your brain when we talk about Abraham. First, sacrifice. It was very common for the Jewish people to sacrifice an animal when they made covenants, but not only to sacrifice an animal, an atonement for sins, a way to say you're sorry for sins. The Jewish people believed that something had to die. The blood had to drain out of something in order for you to be forgiven for your sins, because that was the gravity of sin. Sin equals death. It was very important to the Jews. Additionally, I want you to remember that God asked Abraham, sacrifice Isaac. So Isaac carried wood up a mountain. He carried the wood on his back to his death, which we know in the story, he doesn't actually die. An angel comes and stops the sacrifice. But we are given the parallel to who Jesus would be, because God promised Abraham that his descendants would be countless, but he also promised that the Messiah would come from Abraham's line. So Jesus has to be a direct descendant of Abraham, which we'll get to that, and he is a direct descendant of Abraham. But those are the important things that you need to remember from this Genesis story. Now we're moving to the book of Exodus, the second book in the Bible, and we're going to talk about Moses. So to give you kind of like the Cliff Notes version, because there's so much that happens from Abraham to Moses that we're leaving, I'm not going to talk about. There's a lot of drama. Again, if you like dramatic stories, just read through the Old Testament, read the book of Genesis, and you're just going to be sitting there scratching your head and being like, wow, people are really screwed up, because it's nuts what happens in between that we're skipping. But to Moses. So here's the story of Moses. At this point, the Israelites are slaves in Egypt. And they're just slaves. They work for Egypt, they work for Pharaoh. And the Israeli people are growing in numbers. I want you to picture the situation, because it's a bad situation. So if you think of the people who own the slaves as being a small group and the slave group being enormous, you don't want that to happen for a couple of reasons. The biggest reason being that the slaves could rise up against you. So you always want to keep a stronghold when you have a slave, okay? Don't ever have a slave. But you always want to keep that stronghold over them, because they could overpower you. So Pharaoh at this time, what he said is, we need to suppress the numbers of the Israelites. So he said to the midwives are basically when a woman's giving birth, the midwives catch the baby, they help her have the baby. So he told the Israeli midwives, kill the babies as they're born. The midwives did not do this because they feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. So they just told Pharaoh, they're like, sorry, these women are so hardy that they just birth the babies before we can even get there to help them. So we can't kill them. So what does Pharaoh do? He sends guards to kill the babies. And so he was like, I'll take matters in my own hand, go kill the babies. Moses was an Israeli baby, and what his mother did was take him, put him in a basket, put him in the river, in the Nile River, to save him, because she couldn't imagine a soldier coming and murdering her child. Now this is more than just the story, okay? Did this factually happen? We don't know for certain. Could there have been a kingdom that had Israeli slaves that was taken over? Yeah, there could have been. And there's some historical Egyptian stories that would line up with this being a factual story, but it may not have been. But there's a lot of allegorical symbolism and things like that that are so important to the Jewish people, and that's what I want to focus on with you today. Is not necessarily the historical side, but the imagery and the story that this is telling us that's going to point us to Christ. So when Moses's mother took Moses and put him in the river, this is an important sign, because if any of you have studied Egyptian culture, everything is a god. The Nile was a god. It was an Egyptian god. So in this moment, a baby is placed in this river that's a god of Egypt, and it safely carries him to Pharaoh's palace, to Pharaoh's daughter, where Pharaoh's daughter finds the baby and raises him as if it was her own son. He grew up alongside of Ramesses, another pharaoh. They were brothers, basically, and he grew up in the palace. So immediately in this story, the Egyptian gods are being dealt a huge blow, because this Egyptian god, the Nile River, did not kill this baby that was going to basically overthrow the kingdom. So Moses gets put in the basket. He sails down this river, and Pharaoh's daughter finds him and raises him. And coincidentally in the story, actually, Moses' mother is allowed to be a wet nurse for Moses. So she gets to take care of her son, which is amazing and beautiful. So Moses and the Pharaoh, his brother Ramesses, they grow up in the palace together. And when they're older, Moses sees a soldier, an Egyptian soldier, beating a slave, one of his people, an Israelite. He sees him beating a slave. So Moses kills him. And after Moses kills the Egyptian, he runs off into the desert because he can't just kill people. I guess you kind of can at some points in the Bible, but that's not important at the moment. So he runs off into the desert and basically gives up living in the palace. He finds a lot of happiness there. He meets a girl and falls in love. He's a simple shepherd. And then God comes to him. This is when we get Moses in the burning bush. God comes to Moses and he says, you have to go back and you have to free the slaves. You have to free the people. And there's so many important things about this, because when Moses asks, who are you? Who is this? God says, I am who I am. That's all he says. But the I am who I am is going to be very important, because this is something that Jesus is going to repeat later. But God is telling Moses, I am being, I am existence. He sends Moses to Egypt to free the slaves. So this is basically how it plays out. Again, everything in Egypt is a god. There's a god of the sun, Ra, a god of earth, who's the god of earth, Jeb. There's the Nile River is a god. So Moses, he comes back and he's actually alongside his brother Aaron, his biological brother, who was raised with the Israelites. And he goes to his adopted brother, Ramesses, who's now Pharaoh, because again, he grew up, he ran away. His brother became Pharaoh and he comes back. And so he goes to his brother who's Pharaoh. So he says, listen, God sent me here to tell you to free the slaves. And Ramesses laughs in his face and he was like, prove it. So here we see the battle of the gods. These plagues are more than just a plague, more than just frogs and flies. Every single plague that Moses brings on behalf of God targets a very important Egyptian god. So he comes, like I said, he comes to Pharaoh and he says, free the slaves. And he says, prove it. So what happens? But the Nile River turns to blood. The Nile god, its name is Happy. His name, I don't know if Happy's a boy or a girl, Hapi. The Nile River turns to blood. So this is the God of the Israelites showing that he is more powerful than one of the Egyptian gods. So Pharaoh does not free the slaves, even though the Nile River turns to blood. So the next plague that comes is a plague of frogs. And this targets Heket. Heket is the frog goddess. And so here's Moses targeting another Egyptian god, saying, the God of Israel is stronger than your gods. Free the slaves. Pharaoh still doesn't do it. So Khepri is then sent delta below. Khepri is the fly god because, oh no, that's not the next one. Goes frogs. Okay, so lice is next. Lice rise up out of the earth, which targets the earth god Jeb. Pharaoh still doesn't free the slaves. So then it is the flies. There's a plague of flies that come biting everybody, the livestock, and that challenges Khepri, the Egyptian god Khepri. Next is the livestock begin to die, and that is targeting Hathor, who's the cow goddess. Pharaoh still doesn't free the slaves. So next is boils on the people's skin. The people become covered in boils, and this targets Isis, who's the goddess of health. One after another, all of these plagues keep coming and challenging the Egyptian gods and saying that the God of Israel is greater than the Egyptian god. So after Isis, hail comes, which challenges the sky god Nut, and then storm of locusts. Locust comes next, which challenges the god Seth. Then darkness, which challenges the sun god Ra. And then finally, Pharaoh still won't release this thing's shining in my face. Pharaoh still won't Pharaoh still will not release the slaves. So this is when the final god gets challenged, which is Pharaoh himself, because in Egyptian culture, Pharaoh was a god. So now it's time to challenge Pharaoh. And Moses tells him, listen, if you do not free the slaves, your son will die. Your firstborn child will die. And Pharaoh still will not free the slaves. So this is a plague. This plague is known as Passover, because in this plague where the firstborn children were supposed to die, the angel passes over the Israelites' households, because it wasn't just Pharaoh's son that was dying. It was going to be every single firstborn child in that kingdom. All of the young boys were going to die. And so there were steps given to the Israelites to prevent death coming to their house. This you have to tuck away in your brain, because this is the Mass, okay? This is where our Mass in church, like when you go to church on Sunday, this is where it originates, so pay attention to this. Here are the rules for Passover that Moses gives the people. First, you take an unblemished lamb, you kill it, and you drain the blood out of it and smear the blood on your doorpost. We refer to Jesus as the Lamb of God. This is where that comes from. So first, every Israelite household must take a lamb, kill it, and then with a hyssop branch, the hyssop was a plant that grew there. You take the hyssop branch and you mark your doorpost. After that, everyone in the house has to consume the lamb. So if you think of this paralleling our Mass, everybody at church comes to the altar, they receive Christ, the unblemished lamb, if you're following me, and everybody has to consume it. Nobody can skip participation. You have to do this. No bones in this lamb are to be broken. So the lamb is to be treated very cautiously, taken care of. So, and then in the Passover meal, 4 cups of wine are drank. And this is going to be something that is going to come up when we talk about Jesus, and I will refresh you on it. But what happens is there's the cup of sanctification, a cup of wine for sanctification, cup for deliverance, a cup for redemption. Then they all sing this great Hallel. It's a psalm, actually. They all sing it. And then the cup of the covenant is drank, the sealing cup. So this is something that the Jews, the Israelites, had to do in order for this angel to pass over their house and not kill their children. So the next morning, what happens? Pharaoh's son is dead. The Israelites' children are still alive. And finally, Pharaoh gives up and says, leave. Take the people and leave. And then halfway out the door, when the Israelites are fleeing, Pharaoh comes after them again and is unsuccessful in capturing them. The main thing that I need you to hold on to from this story is this Passover meal that was instituted, because this is something that every single year from this point, the Jews celebrated. They still to this day celebrate Passover. And this is where it began, was in the covenant that God made with Moses. So tuck that away in your brain. I hope you enjoyed this video. It's an interesting story. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise, your questions will be in the email. Bye.